Grace in the biblical context is a central and profound theological concept found throughout the Bible. It is a multifaceted term that encompasses various meanings and implications. In essence, grace refers to the unmerited favor, kindness, and love of God freely bestowed upon humanity. The concept of grace is present from the beginning of the Bible in the Old Testament to its fulfillment in the New Testament through Jesus Christ. Understanding grace in the biblical basis involves exploring its origins, manifestations, and significance in the lives of believers. Grace in the Old Testament. The theme of grace can be traced back to the Old Testament. The Hebrew word often used for grace is chen, which conveys the idea of favor, kindness, and acceptance. One of the earliest instances of God's grace is seen in Genesis chapter 6-9, during the time of Noah and the Great Flood. Despite humanity's wickedness, God showed grace to Noah and his family by saving them and preserving life on earth. Throughout the Old Testament, grace is continually demonstrated in various narratives and encounters. For example, God chose Abraham and made a covenant with him and his descendants, not because of their righteousness, but as an act of grace, Genesis chapter 12 verses 1-3 and Genesis chapter 15 verse 6. The story of Joseph also showcases God's grace as he orchestrated events to bring about the salvation of his people during the famine, Genesis chapter 50 verse 20. Another illustration of grace can be found in the Exodus story, where God delivers the Israelites from slavery in Egypt despite their rebellion and unfaithfulness. Grace in the New Testament. The concept of grace becomes more pronounced in the New Testament, especially with the arrival of Jesus Christ. In Greek, the word often used for grace is charis, which carries a similar sense of undeserved favor and unmerited kindness. The pinnacle of God's grace is exemplified through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. John chapter 1 verses 14-17, declares that Jesus came full of grace and truth, and from his fullness, believers receive grace upon grace. The Apostle Paul, in his letters, expounds on the significance of God's grace in the Christian faith. In Ephesians chapter 2 verses 8-9, Paul writes, "For by grace, you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing, it is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." This verse emphasizes that salvation is a gift from God, not earned through human efforts or merit. Furthermore, Romans chapter 3 verses 23-24 states, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." This passage highlights that grace justifies believers, meaning they are declared righteous in God's eyes, not because of their own righteousness but through Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Grace's role in the Christian life. Grace not only plays a crucial role in salvation but also in the ongoing relationship between God and his people. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12 verse 9, the Lord tells Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." Here, God's grace is depicted as the source of strength and sustenance, especially in times of weakness and difficulty. Additionally, the Apostle Paul's letters frequently emphasize the transformative power of grace in the lives of believers. In Galatians chapter 2 verse 20, Paul proclaims, "I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." Grace empowers believers to live a new life in Christ, no longer enslaved to sin but set free to live in righteousness. Moreover, grace is intrinsically connected to the concept of forgiveness. Jesus, in the Lord's Prayer, taught his disciples to pray, "Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors," Matthew chapter 6 verse 12. God's grace allows believers to receive forgiveness for their sins and, in turn, extends grace to others by forgiving them. Grace is an indispensable and foundational concept in the Bible, revealing God's boundless love, mercy, and compassion toward humanity. It begins in the Old Testament with God's favor towards his people and reaches its climax in the person and work of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. Through his death and resurrection, Jesus offers the ultimate expression of God's grace, providing salvation and reconciliation for all who believe. Grace transforms the lives of believers, leading them to live with gratitude and humility, relying on God's strength in their weakness, and extending forgiveness and love to others. It is a gift freely given, not based on human merit, but solely on God's character and purpose to reconcile humanity to Himself. Grace in the biblical basis is a beautiful and profound demonstration of God's love, underscoring the heart of the Christian faith and inviting all to experience the richness of His unmerited favor and eternal salvation.